Welcome to the Universal Lens channel, getting to the bottom of all things human-centered design. I'm your host, Chris Kovel. This channel will be a forum that will contain dialogues with leaders from diverse backgrounds about the innovation process and how to shape the technologies and products of tomorrow. It will also be a place to trade ideas and discuss methods and philosophies and think more about how cross-functional teams collaborate more effectively. To me, what's at the core of technology is morality. It's not just about what's possible or how much money we can get from our customers. It's about what problems we can solve and how we can make the world a better and more human-centered place, one MVP at a time. Today's inaugural episode features someone who needs no introduction to those of us in the UX community, Steve Portigal. Steve discusses research in UX with an incredibly wise and kind manner, and this was our second time speaking. Few possess the depth of knowledge on user research as Steve, because he's had a front row seat as the field of user research formed and has matured. We had some technical difficulties during this episode, and we're not able to include the video, but please don't let that deter you. I think this was a very enriching and quite a useful episode around the state of UX research in 2023. And now, my dialogue with Steve. So Steve Portigal, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start off with actually talking a little bit about, I guess, your path into the field of user research. So have you always been interested in technology and interested in how it gets made? Was this a conscious effort on your part, like in terms of schooling and then your first job out of school, or did things just kind of happen more, I wouldn't want to put it randomly, but more serendipitously?
Yeah, that's serendipitously is probably the frame to go with here. There was no field of user research I guess there was. I didn't know about any field of user research when I started. In undergraduate program and even went on to a graduate program. But I started off in computer science, which I thought was kind of a making things profession or academic path. It absolutely was not. I don't know what it's like now, but it was the further I went on in computer science, the more theoretical it became. But I discovered human-computer interaction kind of near the end of my undergraduate program and kind of lit up. That this idea that you could think about the way that you make things with the person that's going to use it in mind. And this, I mean, I guess technically we're talking about design more than research, but still just the idea that things were made with intention and that we had to sort of, be intentional ourselves with thinking about, how and what and who. And I remember being in an undergraduate class and the instructor talking to us about some environmental design things, and this was an HCI class, but she said when people have trouble with a revolving door, kind of knowing which way to press it, which way it rotates, she said that's the fault of the people that made the door, not the fault of the person that uses the door. And, it's hard to many years later, it's hard to recreate my surprise at that idea, but it was just a big reframe for me about, who are we as sort of, let's just call us technologists, people that put things out in the world. I had never thought of that. And that I think there was, especially in kind of the bubble of techie people in academia, there was sort of I'm for sure it's still there, right? There's kind of a disdain for people that don't get it the way that we think they should get it. Oh, you don't know how this door works. I can't believe you don't know that. So yeah, some empathy here. It was kind of being taught indirectly. And so I pursued human computer interaction, HCI, as a graduate program. It was not a user research program. It was also not a making things program. Again, graduate school can be very academic. It was very academic and theoretical. But I started to get exposed to little signals here and there. There was this project I don't even know where I found this, in a magazine or something. There was this project that was about, I think maybe it was the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States was figuring, what are we going to do with all this waste so that we can signpost it as dangerous for hundreds of years. It was kind of thinking about future civilizations. And they brought together this think tank of like anthropologists, and I can't even remember who kind of made it up, but there's like really interesting problems that seemed like, okay, human computer interactions about looking at things this way, anthropology is doing this. There are these things in the world that are about, I guess, conceiving solutions from a different perspective. Again, that's still not really research. It's still more kind of design. But all these kind of reframes that were there for me just started to speak to like, oh, there's a path for my career that I don't quite understand what it is, but it feels like it's pulling all these things in that are different. And it wasn't until I got out of graduate school and tried to find a job and ended up in an industrial design studio, and kind of, 1994, 95. So just before the web. I think it was, it was still Netscape. It was not, right. It was Mosaic, I think was the browser. So we just had a bit of the web, but not really internet, not really anything about UX. So there's a lot of work on software for like, software that would ship with a printer that would let you draw something or install a driver, or, industrial tools to check the status of a well, right? These sort of very sort of early, again, we didn't call it UX, but it was sort of UX things. And I was able to, I guess, apprentice at that time to a very nascent practice in user research, whether that was evaluating some of these designs that were being built, or even, offering companies, and it was a consultancy, even offering companies the chance to, like, let's understand your problem a little bit differently. And so we got hired to look at breakfast for a sort of a cereal company that's like, how do we get out of cereal? How do we get out of just shipping the same thing? And, found myself interviewing people and watching them make breakfast and sort of doing what now feels like very classic sort of user research things that were new to that company. They were sort of new to the tech field. Breakfast is not a high tech product, but we did the same thing for laptops and desktop computers and sort of all kinds of categories where we watch people do things. And so I apprenticed to it like that. And you asked sort of, did I know? I mean, once I saw kind of analysis and synthesis, once I saw, talking about things and telling stories as a way to make sense of things, that's kind of when I lit up. I'm like, oh, that's what I do. I always talk about the world and tell stories as a way to make sense. And then I had to really work hard to learn the interview itself, like listening, asking questions, asking follow-up questions, all those fundamentals. I mean, I want to say it was a weird sort of apprenticeship because it's not like anyone else knew what they were doing either. Like it was so early, at least in this organization, that we were figuring it out as we went.
What was the title when you came out and you got that apprenticeship? It wasn't UX researcher, right?
Right. It was, right. We talked about innovation. So it was more, and this consultancy ended up with several practices. And in fact, just for weird politics about who does what in a company, right? We had a separate software design or UX design practice and I was in the part of the business that we called innovation. So I think I was an innovation specialist, which, was not an uncommon title, kind of late 90s. You saw that. And innovation was kind of what we were talking about, sort of new to the world products that would change, a company's top line. And that research was a core of that. But ultimately, we weren't selling research. Research was a service. We were trying to sell the outcome, right? New products to sell, new perspectives about your customer, new ways to be in business or to reach a new market. That's kind of how it was framed.
So yeah, Steve, we were talking a little bit about your path into UX research, and you were describing being a innovation expert or innovation researcher, and the similarities and differences between market research and how it's not market research. It was actually something else. How long did that first job last, and did you know right away that this path, I guess you can say, or this type of work was something that spoke to you? I mean, I remember you saying a little bit that you kind of understood it a little bit theoretically, merging together maybe anthropological work with product development, but actually seeing it in the flesh tangibly did the kind of the lights turn on immediately, or did it take a little time?
Yeah, once I started to get involved, and it was, like I said, it was an apprenticeship, and so it took a little while to where that became my job. So I worked at this company for about 6 years. Probably the last 4 years, I'd say that this is what my job was, and I think it really did click at that point. That's what I wanted to do, and I mean, it's what I've been doing since then. So I did end up sticking with it. So yeah, the lights went on. I think that's a good way to think about it.
After those 6 years, was this when you began to do consultancy, or did you work in more of a traditional, I guess you can say, more like in corporate, with a corporate position?
Well, this was 2001, which was bad time economically. So there was no other option besides starting my business for the most part, and there weren't in-house corporate jobs in user research for the most part. I think you could find a handful. And you had places like Xerox PARC and so on that were doing things, but there was probably a couple of people at Adobe. I'm not saying there was nobody employed in this work. For sure there was, but it was, I'm sure you could find, maybe 100 people or something that had that job. So, and it was a terrible economic time. So there were no jobs. So I think my only path was to figure out how to run my own business, start my own consultancy. That was not something that I had ever planned to do. That was sort of a surprise that, when this company kind of slowly went out of business, that I had to figure out what to do next. Yeah, that was, again, I've stuck with it. So clearly some part of it works for me. It's been, 22 years in the business that I have, but that was never the plan. I think the plan was sort of be part of some other kind of agency. Again, that was really where you would have to be, like maybe somebody at Apple, maybe somebody at Adobe, but really, the most of the people in this work were clustered in agencies like Frog Design and IDEO, were sort of ones that got talked about at that time, at least, where there was a practice of user research, but it was consulting work. It was much more about that than it was about anything kind of in-house at that time. So that was, starting my own thing was the path of least resistance. Like, you can say you're self-employed just by saying it. So I did sort of take that as potentially a stopgap measure, until the economy kind of sorted itself out. And then it just stuck. Like, this is what I like doing. It's got its ups and downs, but sort of it's the way that I did end up working.
Do you have to proactively find clients in most cases, or has it gotten to a point where the work is more coming to you?
that's the number one topic among my fellow independents, consultants, freelancers, is just, you know, what we do in our lives, that is sort of in our work lives, that is the part about getting business. And, I think, I'm still, I'm still learning. I think I'm still learning. What do I do to get business? I think I am, and people that are new to freelancing or consulting always feel like that if they don't want to do sales, and to them that means sort of cold calling people and saying, hey, would you like to buy some services? Because no one likes being on the receiving end of that. But the more I learn from anybody that's kind of a sales professional, like, that's not what you do. You want to try to make somebody ask you if you can help them. And so, you know, certainly for me, and I'm not saying it's the right way or the best way, but I have, spent time being on podcasts, writing books, writing articles in magazines, giving talks at conferences, running workshops, networking, running my own podcast, just doing things that, allow me to be connected to people that, that may eventually be someone to hire me or recommend me, to kind of know about me, so that there's a sense that, oh, we know this person, we think they're credible, we think we have a sense of how they can help us. But yes, I think you have to do kind of different kinds of outreach as well, and talk to people about what they're doing and what they need, and often they will say, "Is that something you can help me with?" But it's much more comfortable for me if someone says, "Can you help us with this?" than for me to say, like, "Hey, did you know I can do this thing for you?" That is not very comfortable. I don't think it's very effective. Maybe some people can succeed like that. But for user researchers, we also have a certain mindset and temperament and kind of way of being in the world. And sometimes that's very it's not compatible with promoting oneself, or, talking loudly about kind of who you are and what you can do. So I think most of my peers who work for themselves also don't want to, sell, kind of, where sell is a bad word.
Hopefully we'll see as the conversation progresses, but I think maybe moving into some of the other topics that we're going to be talking about today will unlock, or will help us understand a little bit more about the different kinds of work that you do as a consultant. Because I think that something I've been thinking a lot about is the difference between, if you want to call it design, capital D, which I think research is included in that, and how the work gets done, and how organizations come together cross-functionally to get a project off the ground. And I think now I've been working myself for a lot of corporations, enterprises, big and small. And I think UX has been growing in a lot of these larger organizations in-house. And they've been bringing on less consultancies, less smaller agencies, less places that specialize in design. And I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing at this point, but it's just a thing at this point. So maybe we can get to that topic at some point. But moving on to specifically talking maybe a little bit more technically about user interviews. So when researching this conversation, I know you've been putting out a lot of content for a number of years around interviewing users. To me, the first question that I have is that it seems as if you're taking a very heavy qualitative and almost anthropological or ethnographic approach, right? Where you're talking about going into the environment where they're doing what they're doing, or living their lives, or using the products, and observing and asking questions, and challenging certain assumptions, having all that kind of come together to understand how people are living their lives, how they're making sense of the things that they're using, that the things that are in their environment, in their Umwelt, if you will. I think that, typically when people think about user research, they think about qualitative research. And do you feel like that type of qualitative research, that type of ethnographic research is synonymous with UX research, or are there other methods that UX researchers should be thinking about and actually practicing on the job?
There are so many methods, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I think we, as a profession, we use a lot of words, and we have different senses of what they mean, right? So, does research mean interviewing? I think that's the right question to ask. And yeah, there's a lot of methods. There's methods that we make up, right? There are sort of prescribed things that we know about. But even if you say usability testing, I mean, an interview is a part of a usability test if it's a moderated usability test. So there are interviews where you also get feedback on something, but I don't know that I would call that a quote concept test. So I think there are sort of formal definitions of methods, and then there are just all these kind of gray areas where you show something, you give somebody an assignment, you have them write something, you facilitate an exercise that are still even within qualitative work, and they're still within kind of contextual work. And then there's any number of sort of data types of things that we do that are looking at, data that's already being produced. When I say we, I don't mean me. I mean like as the field that I think are parts of user research as well. Survey segmentation, are sort of approaches to doing that. And I for sure am focused on something that's a subset of that. I think it's a really important subset. And I think, for a researcher to go from good to great interviewing skills is going to serve them very, very well. And is a sort of a hard skill. It's also very fundamental to how you think about what do you know, and how do you think about what you want to learn, and how do you think about this other person and their experience and their view of the world. Like those are sort of the infrastructure of interviews. And I think you can apply that to lots of other methods that still require you to think about how do I think, how do they think, how am I going to kind of get that from them? So I would rather somebody learn interviewing than learn card sorting, for example, because it's going to pay forward in a lot of in the work and doing the work and making sense of it across methods. I don't know if that's what your method question was. I kind of just jumped into a little soapbox there, Chris, but.
No, that's great. I appreciate getting there, because I think that the field is still coming to terms a lot of times with what it is and the tools and techniques that we use. Because this is another question, another topic that we might get to maybe down the road. But there doesn't seem to be a formalized discipline that's called UX research. Obviously, there are books. Obviously, there are talks. You have been contributing to this for a number of years, but I don't know if there's an actual curriculum prescribing young user researchers, this is our toolkit, this is what we do, this is how we practice the work that we do. You talked about an apprenticeship. I had an apprenticeship too when I began, and I think that most people who get into this line of work almost need an apprenticeship because there isn't a real strong, solid foundation you can get academically that I'm aware of, specifically in UX research domain. I would almost take a step back and look and say that like experimental design is something, because I even look at an interview as a kind of mini quasi experiment where, you have a plan, you're trying to you're trying to go out to learn about something, and it's not just completely exploratory. It may not be super formalized, and you may need to be open and willing to follow up and ask, probing questions that you could never anticipate when you're actually planning. But there does need to be some structure and formalization, I think, of the plan before you go out and execute. And because if you don't, it can be a bit chaotic. It's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And I always think about that concept when I'm designing a research project.
It's a great point. And when I do training for people to give them some experience in doing interviews, there's always a lot of interesting, challenges around. We write these questions, we produce this interview guide, and then we run the interview, and people come back sometimes and they're surprised that they ran out of questions, or the questions they wrote weren't relevant and they didn't know what to do. So I think that's there's a lot of assumptions, and in training, part of the fun is you tell everybody how it's going to work and set them up to be successful, and then they mess it up because they didn't really. You have to learn by doing. So I like in workshops when people realize that they can't write all the questions and have the interview go that way, that they have to be able to kind of improvise or follow leads that kind of emerge, in the moment. Because I don't think that's a natural way of doing a task for a lot of people. So you're right. I think that it is an experimental design. That's a really great frame to kind of put on it. And you almost have to kind of prototype it to see, is it even going to work? Is this going to bring us the conversation that we think that we're going to have? Or are we going to get another conversation out of it that actually is really interesting?
Yeah, I want to follow up a little bit on, the method that you seem to be articulating out. And I would, again, tell me if this isn't the right framing of it or the right how you would think about it, but especially how I look at discovery work, so you're either redesigning something or you're trying to go back to, that first job title that you had as an innovation expert. You're trying to innovate somewhere. You're trying to help design or business find opportunities to provide prototypes or designs to solve a problem, or ultimately to make them money. But I believe that the way that money gets made is through helping people and solving something for them, because why else are they going to be paying you for? We talk about needs a lot, but needs are a bit intangible. It's a hard concept to sometimes pin down. I've heard you talk about how you don't like, or maybe you've evolved, but certainly a talk that you gave a few years ago, you talk about your goal when you're going out into the field and observing and doing anthropological type work, asking people about their lives, asking people about specific contexts. Your goal is not to find pain. It's to do something deeper. It's to find something else. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think in our industry, we hear about finding and locating pain points all the time. But I would like to get your take as to why maybe that's not the best approach, at least in this discovery phase of the life cycle.
Yeah, I think one of the things about pain points is they're sort of misleading. I think one of my themes is trying to understand somebody else's experience from their perspective. And pain points are sometimes ones that we see. We watch somebody use something. We say, well, they're getting lost. This is not, there's a problem that the information isn't presented in a coherent way. And I think that's all well and good. And, maybe you want to fix those things. But, I'm sure we've all had the experience, if we've done research, of seeing something like that and then asking someone about it and having them tell us that they like it. And yes, people tell us they like things because they're trying to be nice to us. But I think when you get beyond that, people still speak positively about something. So I think when you sort of fall victim to pain points, if you will, you sometimes miss the like you said, deeper. There's something else going on. If this is difficult to use, let's say that's kind of a pain point, and people are still doing it, like why is that? Why are they making that trade off? And so, yeah, maybe you fix the pain point, but the bigger opportunity is to understand why somebody would use something that sucks. Like, what is it? What value is it bringing to them? And if we could reduce the friction, that isn't necessarily the big win. Like they're suffering some difficult path, some pain point to get some outcome. And the bigger opportunity may be around like, what's that outcome? Why do you care about this? Why are you willing to kind of do all this to get that? And so, right, like if you want to sell something to a new person, are you going to say, oh, we've reduced all the effort it takes to get to some outcome? Or are you going to sell them that outcome? If the outcome is new, if we're kind of changing the way people go about something, giving them access to, some kind of new content or, some kind of process or something that they don't normally get to do, the fact that we've made it easier is not the big idea. The fact that you can do this thing is the big idea. So, I think it's important for us to keep in mind what people really care about and not get sort of sucked into what seems like something fixable. And if we approach research by looking for what we can fix, then we miss the chance to sort of understand what it's about, what's going on, what do people kind of care about. So keeping our minds open to the bigger picture, I think is just a really key aspect of certainly how I try to approach research.
I like your point about going deeper, about just focusing on pain, especially like I said, if the way I look at research is usually like getting a sense of the purpose, because not always the research that I've done are specifically around this discovery phase, the one that we've been talking about. But when it is, I don't think it's just about pain points and just about watching users interact with, assessing the usability. That seems to be, to me, to come down more further downstream. You bring up a good point, and I keep on going back to, that original title that you had, which was innovation expert, because when we do this more anthropological, more qualitative, upfront research that's kind of divorced, let's say, from a development or a product team, or divorce may not be the way looking at it, but we're not taking quote unquote orders from somebody who's developing something that's a prototype that's already been conceived of, and there's the train is moving down the tracks, and they need to deliver by XYZ date. When you're doing that type of research, it does feel a little bit different. But sometimes I think we forget, or companies forget, when they bring on user researchers or UX researchers, that a lot of the work that we can do is that discovery type work that happens upstream, that happens really without product and design so much involved in it right away. Maybe they will get involved in it. It's a mindset shift. It's about seeing customers and how they interact with the world and how they interact with technology differently, so that you can add some sort of technology or some sort of product or service to that environment to help them in some way, so that they are happier, they more satisfied, this kind of thing. And I think a lot of companies who have researchers and UX departments don't sometimes forget that typically, I think one of our UX researchers' superpower is helping the business or helping the R&D teams innovate. And you don't hear that a lot. You hear more about, I feel like, testing. So I guess that brings me to a question around impact. Have you seen, from when you first started doing research to now, a major difference at all as to who is consuming the research, who is asking for it, how the research gets taken forward and decisions are made? Or has it typically remained pretty stagnant in terms of the audience that's consuming the research that you do?
I think an aspect of impact, especially the way with the examples you're giving, I think also has to do with maturity. So I think one change that we've seen over, it's over the many years, is that there's a lot more of it, right? There's a lot more research happening, um, right? It's just a much, much bigger field. And I think, from organization to organization or even department to department, sort of the maturity through which it's being practiced varies. And I think if I went back a long ways, I would have used my metric for maturity to be, well, how many people do you have? Like, what's the sort of footprint of your investment in it? But I think that would be a naive way of looking at it, because I think you have, you know, armies of researchers in some organizations that are just doing testing. I've worked with teams multiple times where that's kind of where they're at. They're overwhelmed with testing. And in some ways you feel like, well, that's great, right? There's a big demand for research. The people are consuming it. They're asking for it, and they're consuming it, and it is having an impact, but it's having an impact at a less strategic. I realize that becomes there's sort of an elitism attached to strategy. Um, the research that's being done is being used to a certain extent, but there is not sort of a maturity around what other research could be done, what other questions could we be asking, and where could we be using that information to help the company make better products, solve problems, open up new markets, change the way customers experience things, make us more money, all those things. So yeah, I think you have, more practices, more researchers, some that are very mature and that are, where research is a partner with, in determining the strategic direction, as well as kind of ensuring that the products are usable and functional and so on. And you have, all the way, the whole continuum all the way down to, we just do a lot of testing. We test. I guess, and maybe, your question is, how has it changed? There's always been places that just do a lot of testing. And I think we, as a practice, we sort of talk about ourselves in a more elevated way, which makes that gap, right? Our language is much more sophisticated and much more aspirational around what research can do and what its value is. And, we have more books, and we just have a more mature narrative about what research is. So I think when you have a very low maturity organization that just does testing, that kind of does it too late, that doesn't really know what research has been done, doesn't have sort of a direction about what they're learning, what they want to learn, how it connects to what decisions they're making about their products, that feels more dissonant now than it used to, because the field is more mature. So those immature organizations sort of stand out. Are they any more prominent, or more, numerous than they used to be? Probably there's less. Probably we've made kind of collective practice, but I think you do see a lot of, low maturity research orgs that are staffed and are cranking out research, but are not well understood and are not kind of delivering value at the level that they could be.
Yeah. I think I would agree with you. And I think I've been at some of those organizations before and trying to champion it. But, when you're at a large organization where it's just test, it's very difficult to kind of yell into a void, so to speak. I think people on your team know that there's an aspirational aspect to what researchers want and what we would hope to get to, but it doesn't seem like there's clear ways, and maybe it starts and ends with leadership, but when leadership is not trying to push for a higher level of maturity, at least around UX research, it becomes difficult. But, I also want to empathize with leadership, because if you're not in an org that cares as much in terms of trying to be more design led or product led or experimental or, innovative. I think I keep on coming back to that word, innovation. If you're in an organization that just doesn't value innovation, then, you're not going to have people doing the type of work that fuels and helps kickstart innovation projects. It really, I think, does have to do with the mission and vision and structure of the organization, especially with in-house UX research. It might be different, with agencies and this kind of thing. But so yeah, I to kind of end off on talking about interviewing users, a little thing for the past 3 years called the pandemic happened. I would imagine mainly all types of user testing has gone online, 100% remote. You talk about the benefits of going into people's environments, like I said, like an anthropologist might. Do you feel like the online testing has been negative for the field? And do you wish and hope to see in the future, as the pandemic is now subsiding, that we get back to doing more in-person testing? I don't know if it's ever going to get fully back to where it was just because of convenience, but I'm not entirely convinced that that's actually a good thing.
Yeah. I agree. And, we did have remote research before the pandemic. The Nate Bolt's book, Remote Research, is from 2010. Like it goes back a ways. But yeah, certainly and I mean, how great that we could continue to do research through, this catastrophe. So I'm very grateful for that. But boy, I really, really miss just sitting with someone in their office or sitting with someone in their home. It just feels hard, and that there's stuff being missed. There's this, I'm not getting everything. And I think right when the pandemic started, there was a lot of sort of advice being shared about here's how to do remote research. And it was almost, I don't know, it was a very sensitive time. There was a certain smugness that I perceived from people that were practicing that way. Like, see, all you in context researchers, we're going to survive this. And here's how you set stuff up, which unfortunately gets very technical. The process is always technical. I just did a bunch of interviews where we were asking people to share their screen and talk about some of their software. I have to admit, I got all the recordings back and looked at them, and the screen share didn't get recorded. And I don't know why. Actually, there's some ops aspect to how Zoom works with this corporate license. And it just made me feel a little bit like, I don't know, like somebody's grandfather or something, but, this newfangled stuff. But I think I've always wanted research not to come with a big technical burden, because that's something else to attend to that distracts from the work that we're trying to do. And so I even though we can sort of do these remote interviews and talk, there's still like little things that creep in that are work, that are technical, and that, someone may be listening to this and going, oh, you have to change this setting here, and that's what it is. And I'm glad that somebody knows that. But that in 7 weeks it's going to change, and it's different across platforms. So there's a lot of like arcane knowledge to manage it. And I also fear that we're sort of that it's gotten a much bigger footprint because it is easier. There's lots of interesting like inclusion aspects. Like we can go to parts of the world, let alone parts of the country that we wouldn't get to. So we can talk to people in different environments. I think there's an argument to be made that I don't think I'm smart enough to say properly, but people have different kinds of availability. So people that might not be available for more traditional research might be available to be so we can access them through technology. So I think those are interesting. Although I think convenience is the big narrative. So I would love to sort of hear more about the other benefits. It doesn't mean that we can't sort of do mixed samples where we, talk to someone in another country or in a remote location using one platform, and we go out to meet people in another platform. Well, there's no platform there. We're meeting people. I really want to get back to it. I was talking with a colleague this week, and they were describing going with people to a recycling center and sort of watching them go through it. And I was really jealous of them to just have that kind of what to me is kind of an old school experience. So yeah, I'm with you. I hope that it's not sort of gone forever. I'm glad that some of my colleagues are doing it. I would like to return to it myself and my work sooner rather than later, for sure.
Yeah, I just hope that the standard hasn't been put in place. And I don't think it has been. So I think having conversations like this and pushing for in person and pushing for having people come into labs and have face to face, not just conversations but also observations and this kind of thing, is important. And because the last thing I would want to see is just to say, okay, well, it's easy, it's convenient, it's less money. All the research that we can do now can just be done sitting in front of a computer, using Zoom or a platform like user testing or whatever. I mean, it doesn't bode well, in my opinion, to some of these remote testing platforms like user Zoom or user testing. When you schedule participants, in many cases they automatically just set up that Zoom call or that digital call. There's no option actually to have people, to have a geotag around. Let's say you're in Philadelphia, to find people in Philadelphia to recruit from that market and then help people get into your lab or get into a facility. That's just not even an option. So, I do agree with you that, like, I think we need to make sure that we're saying that, while it does save money, like it would be like if you have to go and talk to people, for example, in Florida, and you're in Philadelphia and you don't want to have to pay for researchers to get down there and have a facility if there's no offices down there, that stuff can really, as add up. So cutting costs that way, it does make sense from a bottom line point of view, but there's a trade-off there that has to be brought, I think, into the conversation about data quality and ability to learn, ability to gain insights that you can't gain just having digital conversations with people. So changing topics slightly, I want to get your take and talk a little bit about what you think makes up and this might be a bit of an unfair question because there's probably not one answer to it, but I guess from your perspective, what makes up a good researcher? So another way of looking at it would be if somebody is wanting to get in, is interested in technology and interested in building it from a doing research point of view. If they find that to be compelling, we already spoke about how it's not a typical career path. So if somebody kind of stumbles upon it, how would you? I guess there's two parts to begin with. How would you, looking at really good researchers and working with researchers that you would deem to be very good throughout your career, are there any commonalities that you see across the board with what makes a person a good researcher, and then maybe a corollary of that question would be like, how can people level up to get to that performance or those skills that you've noticed that are valuable?
The skills that I think are important, it's not a complete list, but I think great researchers are they're good listeners, they're good storytellers, they're good noticers. Let's just pick those three. I think, and those are practices. right? Those are ways of living in the world, of being in the world. And you can develop all of those by doing them. Um, you know, People post things to Instagram, and yes, people post their food and their alcohol based selfies, but people also post funny signs or, a weird looking rabbit they saw on their hike, or a beautiful tree that the light is hitting in a certain way. Like, those are storytelling activities. Those are observation and kind of noticing activities. So, seeing the world, seeing it in a quiet, in a new way, and kind of letting that come to you, and then turning it into something and sharing. I think it's like a really lovely thing about at least what social media offers us as a potential. I'm not saying every usage of it is that. Um, I see a little bit about blogging coming back, just like sort of vinyl comes back. I mean, it's, blogging is sort of gone and vinyl is gone, but there are people that are, kind of returning to it. And blogging is an individual practice of, you know, telling stories, describing the world, saying something that's important to you. Uh, and I'd love to see people feel excited about doing that, and feel like this is, um, you know, telling a story, saying something about what you experienced, trying to make sense of it, describing it, even if you just do it for yourself, but publish it. Or, boy, you could keep a diary. I guess you don't have to publish it. Those sort of practices that are kind of regular, they're low stakes, they're repeatable. Um, those are sort of muscle buildings through repetition. And I think, some people are just naturally good at that, or they've spent their lives kind of doing it. Other people need to lean into some facet of that. Um, and I don't think it matters too much what sort of tool or platform, right? We just talked about words and images and publishing and the internet and paper. I think all of those kind of train you to to be better at, yeah, what I think are really great skills in research. I guess listening is sort of a different one. Listening is sort of a way that you think about approaching the world, and our conversations are not sort of listening based. We have to take a different approach. Um, Although I think we have lots of, spontaneous interactions in our lives. The person that makes our coffee for us is just like, that's a random moment of interaction over the course of our day, and being intentional about how we approach that. Like, practice asking a follow-up question, or practice not interjecting with something about yourself when someone shares something about themselves, in these sort of, again, low stakes kind of interactions. I think those are practices that people can do to get better at these things, that are key to being a really great researcher.
No, I haven't thought about those more real world interactions when it comes to researchers, but I can even sometimes think, you know, dating is a kind of interview too. So you can work on, if you're, single, you can work on your research skills too if you're going out with somebody and for the first time, whether it's romantic or not romantic actually, but just having a conversation with somebody and trying to learn more about them. I feel like those are techniques and practices that we as researchers lean into even during our day-to-day. So it does actually translate, when you're out socially and as researchers and doing the actual work, there is an overlap there, which I think you're right about. It's just kind of, to me, I kind of sum it up as curiosity about people and how they view the world and how they approach things. So I always tell people that curiosity is, I think, really correlated with being great at research, wanting to kind of get to the bottom of things and learn more about other people's perspectives. I wanted to get your take in terms of the work that you've, I guess it depends on who is consuming the research, but in many cases, at least for me, either I would classify it into design or business people. It's that's the work ultimately is going to those kinds of folks. Sometimes when I was very early in my career, I was a human factors engineer, and sometimes it would go to engineers. But in UX in particular, it's either one or the other in my experience. Do you feel like having a product sense, an understanding of product design, or maybe even a broader understanding of business and how it operates and how these individuals, what they're looking for, can impact and influence and make you a better researcher?
Yeah, it's the same curiosity thing that you're saying about, learning about people, learning about the world. I think researchers are, their job is not just to learn something, but it's to help somebody else understand it and see how to take action on it. So, part of that is understanding kind of the language and the mindset and the processes that a colleague or someone that you work with uses. So the more you can talk about what a product manager does, or what's the cadence at which goals are set for a team or a product or a project. All of that stuff I think is really good. I think it's the curiosity. And what we do. One thing that we do is we sort of provide sort of a brokerage service and a translation service of, here's what's kind of out there in the world. Here's how people are talking and doing and what they're saying and what they're asking for. And here's kind of how we've organized it and how we've made sense of it. And we're bringing that to you to help you, business person, product person, design person, whatever that is, kind of understand and take action on it. So that translation means we need to have some facility in both those languages, both those ways of kind of looking at the world. I agree with you very much.
For me, at least, trying to learn more about, well-versed with the language games and the type of work that designers are doing in particular, because I sometimes even refer to what I do as a UX researcher as design. A designer who is more skilled, I guess you can say, or takes one part of the process and really focuses on that part of the process, which is understanding your customers and understanding your users, that helps and impacts the design process. So to me, goes back to, where I always try to think when I'm scoping or looking at research in the context, where are we in the design process? Because we're somewhere where, we are either in the beginning, there is no real design attached to it, and it's more of the work that, you've done such a good job talking about in terms of going out and exploring and learning and seeing what's going on in context. Or we're in the process where there's a prototype and it needs to be delivered, or we're testing if we want to know if customers it's going to accept it or not. So having a sense, in my opinion, of where we are in that process, will help make the research that you're doing more tactical. Because if you're downstream, if the team is downstream and has a prototype and you're upstream doing more discovery work, that the ship is kind of sailed. So for me, it's very important to get a sense of what's the purpose of this research. And it's sometimes the teams that are asking for the research have that in mind. They know how to talk to you and they know what they're looking for. And in some cases, they don't. So you have to be proactive, asking a lot of questions, empathizing with them to know, okay, we're here and this kind of method needs to be used because of X, Y, Z, because I ultimately want my research to be taken forward and not just, disappear into the ether after we're done. I want to be respectful for about time. But to finish off, I have two other topics that I wanted to kind of bring up and get your take. One is, and we already touched on this before, and I think it actually might be the most important, or a really important topic within the field of not just user research, but UX in general, which is maturity levels. And then I also wanted to get your take too on being a podcaster yourself. I'm curious if Dollars to Donuts is going to come back or not. I know, you might, it's on a little bit of a hiatus, but to get your take about how, what learnings you've learned along the way of talking with other user researchers and things that you've found to be common across a lot of the people you've talked to. So, but putting that one on the back burner for now, and specifically talking about maturity practices, I guess one way into this, observing the field like you have from that first job, when you were innovation specialist or expert, to now, how have you seen the field actually evolve, and is it heading in the right direction? And do you feel like there's more work to be done? And if so, what are the main, to bring up a phrase that we've heard already, what are the main pain points that you've been particularly feeling within the last maybe 5 or 6 years?
There's the maturity of the field. So who's in it? What do we know? What are we writing? What conversations are we having? What's the discourse? What resources do we have? How are we bringing new people in? All that stuff, I think, is just really progressing tremendously. I'm just excited constantly to meet somebody new or read the writings of somebody new who's, created a resource of some kind to help somebody else succeed. Very tactical things like, what kind of portfolio should a UX researcher have? There's just like very, very specific topics. There's good resources now about, what it means to have a diverse recruit for a study, and what are the tactics that researchers can use to advocate for that. So I feel like there's so many things that we have not talked about that were just sort of left to the side. Bigger social issues. You hear about, I hear much more now, and I've seen talks about this, behavior that's discriminatory or harassing or, sort of generally not acceptable, but still quite prominent. That's something that happens in user research. And so, in some ways that echoes the larger conversations that we have, but when researchers can get together and someone can say, hey, I'm a researcher and this stuff has happened to me, and it specifically happens this way in research, and this is not good and we have to kind of address it. Obviously, it's terrible that is happening, but it was always happening, and we just never had people that could or would talk about it. We've never kind of collectively given it space. So I feel really excited and hopeful, and I guess proud to kind of be in this field where these things are being talked about. And it's not all sort of things tied to, I sort of picked up on, I don't know if the category is social justice or just kind of progressiveness. I mean, I think that's a flavor of the examples that I gave. But, conversations about impact. If you went way, way back, it was just complaining. Anytime there was a chance for researchers to get together, we would complain. No one listens to me. I want to solve these problems. I got invited in too late. They're kind of already coding. They're shipping. Those things exist, but I think people have successes, and they're able to kind of decode those and make recommendations and talk about it. And that's something that I've wanted to talk to people about on my podcast, is kind of get that information out there. So I think discourse and is deeper and broader and more inclusive. I say that from my position of great privilege, based on my age and my experience. I don't mean to say that it's all fixed and we're the sort of the perfect community, but I feel like the discussion looks more like the people that are in the field than it used to. So I'm sort of happy about that progress, and I think it will continue. Um, you know, the maturity again of individual organizations, individual teams, individual practices. I think you have a mix. I think it's an uphill, you know, effort for even very seasoned people. Um, I talked to someone that was leaving that had been at their sort of smallish company for a few years as a research leader and had a lot of success. And I talked to them on the day they were leaving to go to their new job as a research leader in a very well-known, tech giant. One of the, or they would call them the FANG companies now, whatever that abbreviation is for those sort of big companies. They were going there, and they said, "I'm still going to be pushing a rock up a hill in this new job, but maybe maybe the hill won't be so steep." And that was like a very experienced, very accomplished person, and they still felt like sort of the nature of this work is kind of pushing uphill, and they were just looking for kind of some mechanical advantage, in finding the right organization, the right culture. So I don't know. We have to have hope. I have to have hope, and sort of look for those positive signals, but also not be naive and say like, okay, we've solved the maturity problem. We've solved kind of the just sort of the racism and the patriarchy and the inclusion problems. We haven't solved those, but um, there are definite signs of progress, and I don't know. Yeah, again, I feel very hopeful about that, enthusiastic about that even.
Following up how we get more mature and how we keep, in a sense, I mean, I heard, you've said that you were hopeful, and I believe, you were saying as you've been watching the field progress, there seems to be some momentum, some wind at our back, which is hopeful and it is promising but to kind of keep that momentum and that wind going. Are there specifics that you can mention that you would like to see the field? You would like to see developments within the field, within the communities, that could actually be mechanisms to, I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where we're not rolling a boulder uphill to some degree, but to try to level that incline a little bit. So to give you an example, something I've been thinking a lot more about would be things like more communities, more institutions, more structure around training. I don't know if this is something that is even possible or is likely, but having more accredited universities, say, issuing degrees, say in technology research or UX research, anything that you can mention in terms that you would like to see that you think that would be ultimately good for the field as a mechanism to increase maturity.
We should be spending more time looking at the incline that we're rolling the boulder up, and this is some of what I try to do in my own consulting work. Is take some time to look at that and understand it. I think we don't often enough bring the tools of user research to ourselves, as cliched as that may be. I think that, right. I mean, I think if you look at the field overall, and you mentioned this, right, I think at some point in our conversation, we kind of went from a heavy agency world to a heavy kind of corporate team world. And, you lose that outside perspective. And so while it's great that that research leaders can talk about three-sided marketplaces, and sort of speak the language of their peers and other disciplines, I feel like, and this is biased by the fact that I am someone that doesn't work in-house, right? So you're going to hear my bias here. I think that outsider perspective that research always had, given kind of where it was housed, I think gets lost. So yes, the in-house person can translate better, but they become part of the system. They become, they're trying to roll the boulder up, but they also are creating that incline because they're part of that system. And so I would sort of make a case that, you can't wish for maturity. You have to assess it. You have to try to understand it. And you have to, diagnose and put programs in place. And for sure, research leaders are all doing that. I'm not trying to, dismiss their work, but I think they're overburdened. And again, they come from the inside. So, I bet if you have a large team, you don't know what your own people's skills are. You don't know, you don't have visibility into everything. And so I think it needs sometimes a dedicated examination and consideration in order to improve it. I guess that's how I would make the case. Or because, at a profession level, there are things that we can do, but ultimately the implementation is taking place inside companies, and what it really looks like is very localized, right? Company A and company B can learn from each other in terms of what their best practices are, what their struggles are, but it's hyper local. We have this way of doing product management. We have this market. We have this maturity in our marketing business. We have this kind of product, this vertical. All those things are going to really change what it takes to build a more mature practice. And if you don't kind of locally examine it, and what more mature looks like for company A is not what more mature looks like for company B. So I think there is sort of an investment needed of time and focus, and ideally an external perspective to try to see where where strides can be made to move things along.
Yeah. So I think we could talk about maturity levels and trying to make the field more mature for a while now. But just to kind of give a little bit another layer onto what you said there, I really like your diagnosis, or your wanting to shift the examination to the actual organization themselves, because I agree. I mean, I think that in many cases, this design world was always separate from the business, and now it's being integrated. And I think that's ultimately for the good. It's growing the practice. It's growing the discipline. However, how those pieces work together, it's almost, sometimes I think of it as like a business structure point of view, like how, and I think you're right. I think you're right to say that company A and company B are not identical, and it's hard to create a universal strategy to make that, to level out that incline, so that there's less friction in terms of delivering the kinds of work that researchers know that they can deliver to increase and demonstrate the most amount of value. But it does, to me, seem like it's more of a how can organizations and how can teams integrate I'm thinking about design teams and research being a part of them. How could they integrate better within that culture of the business, big and small? And there doesn't seem to be clear-cut ways to do it just yet. So definitely something to continue to think on, something I want to myself to continue to think on too, because I feel like it is an open question right now. And I don't know if we do have clear answers to that questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So Steve, I really appreciate you coming on.
It was great to talk with you, Chris. It's great to talk with you.